The tale of Princess Paliné, who learned the 7 words that stay a dragon's hunger and cool its fires, thus saving her land from the great fire-serpent Malinon, when all the knights and paladins proved luckless. The Princess Paliné possessed the loveliest garden in the loveliest country in all the world. Now it is true that there were many gardens throughout the realm, for the people of this land loved nothing more than cultivating and keeping gardens. It is also true that the Princess Paliné had visited very few of these gardens, and had never set foot outside the borders of her realm. Just the same, she remained quite content with her garden, and had no reason to suspect that it was not the loveliest of gardens anywhere to be found. Her garden abounded in blossom bushes and berry bushes, nut trees, apple trees, flowering trees, and lawns. Many sensible paths were to be found in her garden, leading hither and thither, and in places these paths might come to a footbridge that spanned the little brook that wound its way through the princess's garden. No wonder, then, that the princess thought very highly of her garden. One afternoon, as she reclined upon her couch in the loveliest glade within her garden, munching a luscious apple, the Princess Paliné's tutor paid her a visit. A very old and very wise fellow was this tutor, as it is fitting he should be. He had seen many things in his many days, and always he mused at great length on what he saw before opening his mouth and giving voice to his thoughts. That is why he was considered, by all who consider such matters, the wisest man in all the land, and why His Majesty the King had requested this fellow's services as tutor to the princess. The tutor came to stand beside the princess and smiled. He had plucked an apple for himself from one of the many apple trees in the garden, and it pleased him to munch his apple, finishing it down to the seeds before he uttered a word to the Princess Paliné. The word he uttered was, "Yum." The princess knit her brow and thought very hard on what this might mean. For, her tutor being the wisest of tutors, she knew very well that his words were as sweet as the apples in her garden. And just as apples fall from trees, his words fell from his lips only when perfectly ripe. However, after much consideration, she shrugged. Unable to find any special significance in her tutor's remark, the princess could only conclude that he'd enjoyed his apple very much. "The dragon Malinon will be here next week," the tutor remarked. Now this was another matter altogether. The dragon Malinon, a fierce and hungry fire-serpent, had last visited the land when the tutor was quite beardless, and now his beard had grown so long that it often tickled his ankles. This was a distressing turn of events. The tutor might be obliged to trim his beard. Just the same, the Princess Paliné did not concern herself with her tutor's beard, profound and magnificent though it might be. Instead, she reflected that the arrival of the dragon Malinon would likely interfere with her time in the garden. She was not wrong in thinking this. Do you know the 7 words that stay a dragon's hunger and cool its fires? Asked the tutor. I regret to say that I do not, replied the princess. Said the tutor, stroking his marvelous whiskers, and he arose, bowed to the princess, and left the garden. The dragon Malinon arrived the following Monday. To judge by the scores of farmhouses in flames and the cattle and sheep unaccounted for by day's end, the dragon felt quite out of sorts, yet still nursed a fine appetite. By Monday next, the dragon had already eaten 17 cows, 27 sheep, 43 chickens, a dozen knights, and even a few paladins, which are especially respected knights, the latter having been lightly toasted and dipped in cream from the large vats of a roofless creamery. To the credit of their courage, if not their intelligence, each and every paladin in the land eagerly begged leave to hazard himself against this dragon. After a handful of these had been digested, disappearing in a billowing cloud of smoke and flame, the king ordered his paladins to refrain henceforth from offering themselves as fiery bonbons. It simply did not do for the king's subjects to see a dragon picking his teeth with the armor of knights from the king's own household. This Malinon was making a great nuisance of himself. One way or another, the princess must learn the 7 words that stay a dragon's hunger and cool its fires. And so the Princess Paliné finally began her search for these precious syllables. She inquired of the greatest minds in all the land. Astronomers and astrologers, alchemists and architects, sages and sorcerers. They gathered together in a great and solemn council and argued for 9 hours before offering her 3 words. Perambulation, concupiscence, and angioplasty. The princess wrote these down carefully. She needed some help with the spelling, and then turned her thoughts to whom she should ask next. Her tutor seemed a wise choice. The royal tutor stood upon the neatly trimmed lawn outside his cottage, playing croquet when the Princess Paliné arrived. He gave his ball a good smack, and the ball shot from his mallet like a comet, missing every wicket and stake within 20 leagues. The ball rolled into the woods and vanished, yet the old man seemed unfazed, for he turned and bowed to the princess without missing a beat. The princess noticed that he stroked his beard regretfully. The fellow had finally been obliged to humble his whiskers, and the beard now lapped at his kneecaps rather than his ankles. He leaned on his croquet mallet and grimaced, glancing ruefully at his bandaged foot, which he'd injured while tripping over his beard on his way to the barber's. I would be grateful if you could offer me a word for my collection, said the princess. The tutor thought long and hard, trying to remember the 7 words that had saved the realm so long ago when he was young. Suddenly he opened his mouth and raised a finger in the air. Then he paused and shook his head slowly. "No, that isn't it," he muttered. This sequence repeated itself a number of times without success, until the princess, her patience sorely taxed, begged the tutor for a word, any word. "Lemon pie," said the tutor. "That's 2 words," the princess observed. "All the better for you," remarked the tutor. The Princess Paliné now had 5 of the 7 words she hoped would convince the dragon Malinon to do his dining and demolition elsewhere. After considering her gardener and her nurse as possible sources of the remaining words, the princess, to her credit, decided to honor her mother and father, the queen and king, by requesting a word apiece from their majesties. She found the royal couple relaxing on their thrones, playing at a game of cat's cradle. "Mother and father, I have been offered 5 of 7 words by the wisest and most esteemed scholars in the realm," said the princess. "Your majesties would honor me by providing the remaining 2. "Obedience," said Her Majesty the Queen, without glancing up from the game. "Respect," said His Majesty the King, furrowing his brow as he rendered a hopeless tangle of the string, the Queen's fingers, and his own digits. "My gratitude, sires," said the princess, curtsying and withdrawing gracefully from the hall, while keeping her head bowed toward their majesties, for one must never turn one's back on royalty. As she withdrew, the princess realized, with a tinge of sadness, that among the 7 words she had been given, there had been no room for love. Yet no sooner had this thought occurred to her, as she stepped into the passageway beyond the throne room, than her mother the Queen recalled her. "Sweetheart," sang Her Majesty. The princess quickly re-entered the room and approached politely. "Yes, Your Majesty?" "Darling, there is no need for such formality when we are alone. It would please me so much if you would call me Mamma." "Yes, Mamma," said the princess with a big smile. The king had finally disentangled himself from the string and glanced up at his daughter pleasantly. "Your mamma and I thought it would be nice for the 3 of us to take a picnic lunch down to the lake. Would you like that, Duchess?" As a fondness, the king had taken to calling his daughter Duchess. This was, admittedly, an unusual pet name for a princess. "Oh, Papa, that would be lovely," the princess enthused, throwing her arms around her father's neck. She gave her father and mother a big hug, and the 3 chatted and played for a while before the princess excused herself to dress for the picnic. I'm afraid she forgot her manners completely when she left their majesties, for instead of curtsying and backing respectfully from the hall, she skipped from the room singing a song about a pony and a flower pot. Not that their majesties noticed this breach of protocol, for the Queen had seated herself upon the king's lap, and she was tickling his ears shamelessly. It seems there was room for love after all. The next morning, the Princess Paliné set out to find the dragon Malinon. Word of mouth indicated that the drake had moved his nest to the south, where orchards and flocks aplenty were to be found. And so Her Highness turned her steps southward. She traveled without escort, for the land was at peace, apart from the terrible dragon, and she felt it high time she had a look at it. The princess paused to refresh herself in wayside inns and hamlets along her route, and it surprised her to see that many of her subjects tended gardens of their own, and that these rivaled Her Highnesses in breadth and beauty. It pleased the princess that this should be so, for rather than feeling rancor and jealousy at her subjects' prosperity, she understood that their prosperity was her own, and she commended her people and entreated them to continue cultivating their gardens. Throughout her travels, on dusty roads and forest paths, she saw errant knights mounted upon great steeds, the shining armor of horse and man bedecked with emblazoned capes and bright plumes. Along fields ablaze with summer wheat, the princess watched farmers and field hands swinging scythes that flashed in the sunlight, singing as they worked. In towns and villages, she observed red-faced merchants crying their wares from within booths that tempted passers-by with innumerable sounds and smells. And in one village, the princess had witnessed a young boy begging his mother for sweets. "Please," the child whined and sobbed and entreated, until the beleaguered woman had relented and purchased a knave on a pike, that is, a candied pear on a lemon stick, for the boy. At this same merchant's stall, a trio of urchins had imitated the spoiled child. "Please," they cried, hands outstretched, blinking away their crocodile tears. "Go away," the merchant replied, dismissing them with a toss of the wrist. "Mister," they sang piteously, until he reached for a broom and the imps scattered, laughing. Alongside the cellar of sweets, a blacksmith had hung his shingle. As he tempered a length of glowing steel, shaping it with the blows of his great hammer, his skillful foot applied careful pressure to the pedal of a bellows. With each press of the foot, air was forced into the brazier, and the coals heaved and sank, the orange embers cracking and pouring forth their white guts with a furious hiss. Children had gathered round the blacksmith's stall, and these stared, wide-eyed and open-mouthed, at the angry furnace. "Fire-breathing dragon," a little girl whispered slowly. Frightened by the sound of her own voice, she buried her head in her mother's frock. The blacksmith had laughed loudly at this, his sides heaving like his own bellows. Yet the mother's own nervous laugh caught in her throat, and she ushered her daughter quickly away. Princess Paliné had seen many things by the time she approached the dragon's lair, made evident by the reddish glow and sinuous plume of smoke that issued from the old cave, seated amidst a burnt and desolate landscape. The glow that shimmered from the mouth of the lair reminded the princess of the blacksmith's shop. She stood a respectful and discreet distance from the cave, wondering what the proper way to pay a call on a dragon might be. For she had been taught how to approach a king and queen, how to acknowledge a duke, take leave of a baroness, and greet an ambassador. But her education had failed her as regards mythical beasts. She could no more curtsy for a unicorn than she could greet a griffin. If she smiled at a sea serpent, would that be rude? These weighty matters had been her concern for only a few moments, however, when a blast of warm air, a waxing of light from the cave, and the sound of a great bulk being hauled over gems and gold and all his hoarded treasure informed the Princess Paliné that the dragon drew nigh. Rather than taking fright at this development, the princess smiled with relief at being spared the burden of initiating the greeting. The great fire-serpent shuffled forth on 4 stubby legs until its enormous head came uncomfortably close to Princess Paliné. Malinon circled about the princess, eyeing her front and back, up and down. The princess wisely and carefully kept her eyes averted, throughout this inspection and the subsequent parley, for she knew that to gaze into a dragon's eyes was to lose all memory and identity.
"You're a tiny morsel,"
observed the dragon, its deep rumbling voice rustling the naked branches of the scorched trees nearby. The princess struggled to keep her feet.
"I can't be certain I'd even taste you going down. What is your name?"
"Palinay. I am the Princess Paliné. Your dragonship, Drakeness, Worminance," she said, stammering. Still, the princess managed to offer a splendid curtsy, and the dragon narrowed its eyes, intrigued. For a long moment the drake silently studied the princess. Then the worm encircled her, resting its horrendous head upon a thorny tail. The dragon's scales glistened iridescently in the pale light that managed to penetrate the clouds that surround a dragon's lair. The Princess Paliné was very frightened, but she stood straight, holding her head high, for she was determined to honor her office as best she could.
"You have 7 words to offer me," said the dragon. "Speak them."
The princess's hand shook as she withdrew a folded parchment from the folds of her dress. Her voice trembled a little as she read her list to the worm. Perambulation, concupiscence, angioplasty, lemon pie, obedience, respect. A moment passed before a low rumble began to emanate from the dragon's underbelly. Soon the drake shook uncontrollably. He turned his head from the princess because his laughter now came in such abundance that fire and brimstone began spewing from his nostrils, setting ablaze the charred skeletons of the ruined trees. Angioplasty, concupiscence, lemon, obedience, pie, perambulation, respect, the princess blurted out, thinking that perhaps the words needed to be alphabetized. Tears began streaming from the dragon's eyes, mingling with the brimstone and creating a halo of steam above the dragon. His laughter positively pained him now, and he beat the ground with his claw. The princess, tottering on dancing feet as the ground shook beneath the blows of this great fist, collapsed to her hands and knees. Malinon howled and gasped.
"Dear me! Ah! Oh, my eyes!"
Some time passed before the creature could collect himself, by which time the princess's trepidation had been succeeded by irritation. She sat on the ground, her arms crossed, shaking her head at the dragon. "I am to understand that those are not the required words?" she said curtly.
"No, they are not,"
the dragon croaked. He sighed deeply.
"That is the worst collection of words I have ever heard. And believe me, I've heard some corkers."
The princess rose to her feet, saying with enormous dignity, "There is no call for insults." The dragon grew suddenly quiet. "The greatest minds in all the land gave me those words," the princess observed. The dragon inclined its head toward Princess Paliné and said,
"You are correct. I have every right to eat you, but no right to insult you. In token of apology and gratitude for the laughter you brought to an old worm's heart, I offer you a second try, a championship round, shall we say?"
The princess pursed her lips and thought to herself, if the wisest heads in all the realm had failed, how could she succeed? None of the words she had ever learned seemed special enough. Then she suddenly knew the 7 words that stay a dragon's hunger and cool its fires. Please go away, Mr. Fire-breathing Dragon, she whispered.
Eh? What was that?
Asked the serpent, its eyes narrowing unpleasantly. Please go away, Mr. Fire-breathing Dragon, she laughed aloud. The worm uncoiled itself, its wings unfurling and beating the air. Faster and faster they turned, until the dragon rose high above the cave. The force of this gale he created even dispelled the layer of clouds that had shrouded the vicinity for many a day. The worm paused, poised at a height thrice the span of a dozen men standing upon one another's shoulders, and then it swooped toward the ground, halting just inches from the princess, who blinked in the newly liberated sunlight.
Never forget those 7 words, the dragon whispered. For on the day you forget, I will return.
And with a rush of wings, it was gone. The Princess Paliné never did forget the 7 words that stay a dragon's hunger and cool its fires. She returned to her beloved garden, and the realm prospered. In time, she became queen in her own right, and found an eminently suitable husband to be king. She commanded the royal sign maker to engrave the 7 words above the palace gate, so that all who entered therein would remember what the Princess Paliné had overheard from a spoiled boy, a merchant, a trio of urchins, and a frightened little girl. And the queen had other words engraved beneath these 7. The words, you ask? There is room for love, after all.